This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast number 128, part 2, Suffering. I am Hal Hammonds, and I am a citizen of heaven, and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for coming back this week. If you missed the first part of my conversation with Matt Bassford and Keith Stonehart, please do yourself a favor and check it out. We covered the role suffering has played in their own lives and the lessons they have drawn from it. We begin the second part by discussing the mostly well-intentioned doctors who killed off my favorite president. We close with advice on how we can exercise reasonable preparation without living in fear. Let's start with what I've been reading. I've been reading Destiny of the Republic, a book focusing on the assassination of my new favorite president, James Abram Garfield. It's generally said that Garfield was killed by Charles Guiteau. In truth, Garfield was killed by his doctors. Warnings went out from numerous doctors who knew of Joseph Lister's advancements in sanitation, but older heads chose to hold to the old paths. Months later, Garfield finally succumbed to infection. Ignorance kills, and good motives don't change that. What are some ways that well-intentioned people make a bad situation worse, and how have you responded?
Man, that's a tough one. There have been several instances in my life where I know people meant well, but the result was bad. And it's hard not to have an attitude that says, thanks, but no thanks. It's also hard to keep in perspective that their motive was not evil, or their motive was not, bad, but it just ended up that way. Those are the times I think where I have really found myself struggling to extend grace, because it's very human of us to think that, well, in this situation you don't deserve it, but the truth is that none of us deserve it, and yet God gives it. And yeah, that's a tough one. I'm gonna have to think about that for a minute.
That's really fascinating that you reacted the way that you did, Keith, because in my experience, I've gotten 10 years ago, I got a couple of tacky comments about my daughter. This time around, I've got a couple of tacky comments about my diagnosis and my struggles with depression and all that stuff. But it's not really anything that has made a huge impact on me that I grapple with, because I think Christians are much better at dealing with suffering when the sufferer is not in some way responsible. Because in my case, the fact that I have ALS is due to my brilliant choice of mothers. That this is written in every cell of my DNA that this was going to happen to me. And people can deal with that. Here is this good guy who has just been struck down through absolutely no fault of his own, and so I'm going to be supportive and compassionate. And even some people who really don't like me very much have reached out and been really caring and supportive because they empathize with me. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with somebody who has made all kinds of mistakes and gotten themselves in all kinds of disasters to reach the point where they're suffering, that's the sort of thing I think that tempts us to drag out our pedestals and start preaching down at that person from the pedestal. And that's when you get help that is probably well-intentioned, but is not actually helpful at all.
Yeah, it's a weird dynamic for me where, I guess where I struggle with it is where I believe that there are people that should know better, that do the opposite, as opposed to people who don't know better and that are struggling. I have the exact opposite where, where I look at those, just for an example, I think a lot of times we love to take the teachings of Paul regarding immorality, that we love to take those teachings to the immoral and say, see what the Bible says about this, and we kind of weaponize it in a way. But when you realize that those teachings were written to Christians, that Paul is writing the Corinthian letters to the church at Corinth, when he's writing about the works of the flesh in Galatia, in Galatians, he's writing to the church in Galatia. Those letters were written to people who should have known better, or at least to some degree. And we often take those teachings to the lost. And I guess it's an unintended, because I don't, like I said, I don't believe that we believe that we're doing wrong, but it does damage. And that's where I guess that's where I get, hey, thanks, but no thanks. Don't help me. The example I tell people often is that the first door knocking I ever went on when I was first a Christian, I was paired with an older gentleman. Because I was young and a new Christian, and he was older and more seasoned, they paired me with him to go knock on doors. It's a hot August day. I'm in shorts and a t-shirt. He's in a suit, right? So we knock on the very first door, and the woman answers the door, and he says, "Hello, we're from the Mountain View Church of Christ, and we're in the area. Just wanted to reach out to you and share the gospel with you if we could for a minute, and invite you to church." And she says, "Well, great. Well, thank you." And he says, "Do you know that if you died today, you'd probably go to hell?" I mean, that's the first thing he said to her, right? And so that's the kind of help that I'm talking about. I mean, he meant well, but the door slammed in our face, obviously, and she invited us to go ahead of her, so to speak. And that's the kind of the thing that I'm talking about. It's where that person meant well, but that's not what happened. And so it's hard. I think it's hard sometimes to get past that. I know for me it is anyway. It's a struggle for me.
Well,
and
go ahead.
Yeah, you talk, Hal. Okay.
Well, it's a fine line to walk between speaking from the position of moral authority, saying you need to be more like Jesus versus you need to be more like me. It's very, because from a practical standpoint, from the position of moral authority, they look like they're the same thing. In fact, being like me might be easier than being like Jesus, because 1 Corinthians 11:1, that sort of thing. If you would emulate the people who are emulating Jesus, you would be better off in your life. And when the suffering, like we're talking about here, is a result of choices that I have not made, choices that other people have made, and here we are, that can get into it can sound more egotistical than it is intended. It may be more egotistical than we realize. It's a difficult line for us to walk in that situation.
Absolutely.
And my experience is that very rarely do people need to be told what they're doing wrong because they know it and they're ashamed of it.
Yeah.
And I suspect that back in your atheist days, Keith, that you felt deep shame about yourself and about the things that you had done.
Yeah.
But you just didn't know what to do with it.
Yes.
And I've learned this the hard way. I've been much more condemnatory than I should have been at sometimes. But these days, I mean, if you're just having a conversation with somebody, hey, how are you doing? And they know that you're a preacher. This is especially true with struggling Christians. Then all this stuff will just come spilling out. You don't have to convict them because they have already convicted themselves.
Yeah.
And it is people like that who, if you offer them the hope of grace, will seize upon it.
Yeah.
And how beautiful it is to be washed clean, to get to start over.
Absolutely. My grandpa used to say, and I use this a lot in sermons and that whatnot, but I have a lot of my grandpa's sayings that were just just old wise truth, but he said, you never tell a man he's sunburned. He knows, you know, and I love that frame, but because, you know, inevitably, if you're sunburned, someone comes up and go, wow, you are really sunburned. And you're like, I know, I feel it. And so rather than pointing out the obvious, I think sometimes what we need to offer is aloe, you know? So you're absolutely right. I mean, in those days, you walk around defensive, you know, because you're aware. You know, when I talked about, you know, me fighting so much, you know, my freshman year of high school, it was because I was hyper aware of what had happened to me. And so I had long hair because, you know, I was a musician, and that's what you did in the late 80s, you know, if you're a musician. And so if anyone made a comment like pretty boy or anything to that tune that was effeminate sounding or whatever, I was already on the defensive. And so you lash out. And so yeah, I completely agree with what you said.
Let me get your feelings on the expression, and I've heard this 100 times, and I've heard it lambasted, I've heard it preached from the hilltops. I know just how you feel. I know just what you're going through. Is that received well, or is that received poorly?
I think so. I've had good and bad experiences with both. I've been told in a certain situation that I was dealing with, hey, I understand this, you know, and I knew that this person did, and so it was very comforting that someone was there with me. You know, I think we talk about Job and his 3 friends sometimes, and we often just focus on when they turned on him. But in the very beginning, what did they do? They went and they just sat with him. And I think there's something very powerful about just being with someone in that moment and identifying, right? Now later they obviously, you know, turned on him, and there's a lesson in that too. But it's been very comforting to me personally. And I've also had the opportunity to go and sit with someone and say, man, I understand this. I understand where you are. And I think it was reciprocated well. But at the same time, I've had people say, listen, I know exactly what you feel. And the only thought that comes through my mind is like, how could you? Yeah. How could you know exactly what I feel right now? You know, whenever my wife was diagnosed with cancer last year, you know, that initial shock of that. And you have people that say, hey, listen, you know, we dealt with this too. And in some sense, the last thing you want to hear is everything's going to be fine, because it doesn't feel that way right now, right? It doesn't feel like everything's going to be fine right now. And so it comes across as kind of snarky, you know, to say, listen, you shouldn't worry about this. I'm like, yes, I should. She's got cancer, right? I mean, that's, you know, but in the same sense, I had people come and say, listen, you're going to get through this. And that made a difference, as opposed to someone saying, listen, I've been through this. I know what I'm talking about. Listen to me. As opposed to someone saying, we've been through this and we're here for you, and I believe that you're going to get through this. It's very different. And so I believe it's good and bad. I've had good and bad experiences with both. And I will say this, I learned, if nothing else, during that time period, you know, where I learned that well-meaning people sometimes don't mean to inflict harm. They're well-meaning. They really want to try to help. But it doesn't always come across like that. And so I think we just have to be graceful and gracious with each other.
And maybe the difference that you're pinpointing is the question of whether somebody is willing to sit with you in your suffering, or whether they're trying to dismiss your suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because, you know, saying, oh, don't worry, you're going to be fine. That's saying, you know, you're making a much bigger deal out of this than you should, because really this is nothing.
Yeah.
And I think that indicates the way in which some experience, even that's very similar, can lead us to minimize and trivialize the suffering of others.
Right.
But when we do have people who say, I have been through this experience that is like yours. I lost a child in the same way that you did. Then I found that powerfully helpful, at least in part because, generally people who have lost children don't dismiss that as a trivial experience.
Right.
And although there was one lady who told my wife, "It's okay, you'll have others," which was not helpful.
No. Well, yeah. Lots of those comments, right? I mean, it's real. They're trying their best to be encouraging, but not.
And some people, I think, don't realize how self-centered they are. They don't realize they're trying to be sympathetic, but the expression, they make it all about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in our right minds, and we're not always in our right minds when we're suffering, but in our right minds, I think we can tell the difference between someone who is reaching out to us and offering us their heart versus someone who suddenly is put in a position of expertise and wisdom and wants to show off a little bit. I think that generally, with a straight mind, we can tell the difference between the two. And I'm not sure exactly how much difference that makes, because if you have a straight mind, then you're able to filter that out. You're able to say, well, so they were a jerk. Frankly, I knew they were a jerk 2 years ago. I don't need any information on that. I already have that. So what? We're moving on. I could deal with it 2 years ago. I'm dealing with it now. It's fine. We would wish that we would find a better way to sympathize. And that's why I bring this up, because I listened to your story and my story, the stories that you two are I listened to what you two are telling me here, and I don't have a comparable story. I've suffered in my way, like we all do, but I find myself very much on the outside of this kind of experience, wanting to help and feeling completely inadequate in this situation, because we fall back on trite sayings like, "I'm here for you. Let me know what there is I can do. Will you have our prayers?" And it seems so worthless in the moment. I don't know if it is worthless. I don't know if it contributes anything. I don't know if maybe just kind of sitting by their side and holding their hand for half an hour would be a better thing than not open my mouth at all. Job was doing okay, with his friends until Job started talking. When Job started talking, then all of a sudden Job's friends kick into gear. Oh, we have to deal with this. Is saying that, those trite sayings, is that helpful at all?
Well, I'll tell you this. I never really thought about it until I had to. That once we were in our situation, the one and again, well-intended, truly heartfelt expression of wanting to help. But when you're in that, for me, when we were in that situation, the last thing I wanted was to have to give people directions. Hey, what can we do? Can you cure cancer? Because that's really what I need, But what I found that helped me the most, I mean, and this is only from my experience, can I say this? This probably isn't true for everyone, because I think there, to some degree, all those things are very comforting to at least express the fact that you're not alone. That I think at the core of every situation like this, no one wants to be alone. But the one that worked for me the most was Terry Francis called me one morning, and I hear the phone's ringing, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh man, I'm about to have to tell someone what to do, And when I said, hey man, and he said, hey dude, he goes, you got a minute? I just wanted to pray with you. And I said, yeah. And he just launched into a prayer right then. I mean, that was it. Hey man, I want to pray with you. You got a minute? Yeah. And then he starts praying. And then at the end, he says, I love you, dude. See you later. Click. completely changed my perspective on what I needed anyway, because I don't know that I knew until then. And I was like, that's all I need, man. I need people to pray. I need her name to go before the Father as often as possible. And that's what brought me true comfort, was just a prayer, not a discussion, not a, because I mean, a lot of times people are again, they're wanting to help us. So they're like, well, how's she doing? Do you guys need anything? I mean, and they're from the best place possible saying, I want to help. But it's work, and you're having to answer and give directives. And, for us in that situation anyway, it was really hard to do that. But when Terry called up and just prayed with me, it was amazing how much different the rest of that day went. And I would say probably the rest of the period while we were dealing with it, that I knew she was being prayed for. And that helped me the most. I can't speak for everyone, but that's what meant the most to me.
Yeah, my experiences are similar. That, it mattered a lot when somebody who had lost a child came to me and said, I've been through this. I know how you feel right now. I'm praying for you is never unwelcome, especially when people actually take the time to pray with you. That's wonderful. Saying I'm here for you, I think, is also meaningful, because
Yes.
it reminds me that there are all these people who love me, who are going through this with me. That's powerful.
Yeah.
Probably the times that have been most meaningful to me have been when somebody stopped some public gathering or assembly and led a prayer just for me. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But as for what can I do? Yeah, you're absolutely right. That comes from a great place. That's people who are trying to fix it and make it better.
Yeah.
And I completely understand why they would, because I myself am a fixer. I want to make everybody's lives better. But it kind of has a pop quiz effect. Like, okay, they've put me on the spot. What do I have to come up with for them to do so they can feel better?
Right.
And I mean, the time is going to come when my family and I are likely to need a lot of help, but we're not there yet. And so my sort of stock answer there has become, we really appreciate the offer. We'll let you know when the time comes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's funny how your experience there tracks mine.
Yeah. All right.
Absolutely.
I'm going to stop here again. It's good stuff there.
Recording stopped.
I found that if I cut the long recording into pieces, it seems to preserve the... This is what I've been playing. Been playing Galaxy Trucker. You build a spaceship out of spare parts as quickly as you can, and then you set out to make your fortune, taking bits of whatnot to the deep reaches of space. You can work slowly, building the perfect ship and missing out on the best opportunities, or you can work quickly and run the risk of having your ship fall apart. Life has its perils, and being prepared ahead of time certainly helps. But if we spend every moment bracing for impact, we wind up not setting our foot on the road at all. Is there a way we can prepare for hardship without giving in to fear?
I love it when Jesus sends out the 72, and he tells them, he sends them with a sword. Now I may be getting my stories mixed up here, but I believe he tells them to be, harmless as dove, but wise as serpents. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great admonition in general, and just in life in general. I think, whether it's, we're anticipating a problem, but the idea of the Boy Scouts, always be prepared. There's an aspect there in which if I am prepared to act, then I don't react. I think that, when you're a kid and you go to the doctor and they hit your knee with a hammer and it flies up, that's a reaction. And the reaction is the negative response to the positive hit. And if we go through life reacting to everything, and we haven't really given any thought or preparation to acting when something arises, our response, the majority of the time, has a tendency to be negative. That if I haven't given thought to how I'm going to respond, if I'm out somewhere and someone says, "Hey man, do you want a beer?" My initial response would be to get angry about, don't you know what I've dealt with, and to respond in this angrily way, or I can just say, no, thank you. A lot of that is going to be dependent on how I've prepared myself. What answer will I give? And I think in crisis situations where suffering is a reality and often a consequence of whatever the situation is, we have to give some thought to that as well. And I believe there are a lot of biblical principles that point to that. But I really lean hard on Jesus just being, take your sword, be wise as a serpent, be harmless as a dove, and just be ready for what comes.
My perspective on this is a little bit different because I had a lot more warning in one instance than I did in the other. I mean, my daughter being stillborn was completely unexpected. Just boom, here you are. The ALS is very different because most people have what's called sporadic ALS, where it just pops up and no one knows why. But in a minority of cases, it's what's called familial ALS. It's something that you inherit. And in my case, it's the latter. My mother died from ALS. My uncle died from ALS. And when my mother died, because my uncle died first, when my mother died, I realized, I may well have a problem here. And that was about 10 years ago. And so there is a sense in which I have been preparing, certainly financially, but in other ways as well for this to happen. I mean, I've been telling people for years it's likely that I'm not going to live long enough to draw Social Security. And they thought I was being dramatic, but I knew I wasn't being dramatic. And that sounds good, but I think in a lot of ways it was harmful, because when I started getting symptomatic, because this was something that I had worried about and feared for so long, I really struggled to deal with that. I could not be honest about what those symptoms meant. And all the mental conflict there really produced all sorts of anxiety and depression in me to a debilitating extent. Arguably, no, it's not arguable. I'm in a better place mentally with a terminal diagnosis than I was when I was just afraid of a terminal diagnosis. And so, in a worldly sense, I don't know that preparation is really all that useful. I mean, in a lot of ways, my family and I are better prepared because I had that warning, but it was very difficult in other ways. That the best preparation in both cases was simply that of trying to develop spiritually, where you study the Bible, the Bible, and you find in the moment that without having realized it, that you are equipped to deal with this because the scriptures have equipped you. These days I am reading 2 Corinthians 4-6 in a whole new light. That I think there is stuff there where it's talking about your outward body decaying, but your inward man being renewed day by day. I don't know that I really understood what that meant until now. And so I think it just shows the great wisdom of God in that he is giving you the tools that you need to deal with anything in your life, except you have to familiarize yourself with those tools beforehand. That there is a whole range of Bible passages. There's a whole scriptural narrative into which my situation right now fits very neatly. And I had no idea that that would be true. But it's just, once you're in that situation, then you see what you have in the Word. And you see what you have in your relationship with God.
Well, they say that about great art. You watch the people who watch the art, and they always look kind of silly, right? Because they come at it and they look at it straightforward and kind of look at the Picasso just face on, and they have this really studious look on their face. And then they move like 6 feet to the left and look again, and they look again, and another studious, and then they move over here, and just from these different perspectives, and supposedly people who know what they're talking about. I'm busy reading a book on Picasso right now, so that's kind of where my head is. And the people who know art say that it really makes a difference. The perspective that you're coming from, regardless of the style of art, gives you a different insight into something that has not changed necessarily, something that is the same. And that's what suffering will do, or blessings, or what have age, same thing. Looking at the same passage, looking at the same set of circumstances, or what have you, from the sufferer rather than the onlooker or the ignorant person or whatever, it brings new light to things, including scripture, like you're saying there. It's the outward man is suffering, the inner man is being renewed day by day. The implication seems to be that what happens to the outer man affects the inner man. That's why he's putting the pairing together there. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's no point in calling it a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the way that it is. The important thing is that whatever happens to the outer man or doesn't happen, we take this as an opportunity to draw closer to God. We renew the inner man, because we do have control over that. God may or may not affect our outward circumstances, but we have complete control over the attitude that we take toward these things. It doesn't feel like we do in the moment, but you can own your circumstances. You can own your situation in life and say, I'm going to take this and I'm going to point it toward God. And prayers come up prominently in the discussion already. That's the obvious way to do this, your own prayer, the prayers of others. But fundamentally, it's just a mental state, isn't it? I'm going to go to God with this. I'm going to cast all my anxiety on the Lord because he cares for me, and trust that this is going to work something in my life or in my family's life or in the life of somebody else.
Yeah, and I think it's especially the latter, because when it comes to suffering, I do not believe that there is anything out there in any religion, in any philosophy, that better equips you to deal with suffering than the Bible does. Because the Bible's theology of suffering is so deep and is so profound, and the answers are so good. And that means that if you know your Bible, then you also know how to suffer.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. That's one of the things that I try to emphasize, especially in working with a lot of young people like I do. I'm heavily involved with the Alabama camp here. And we have a pretty large number at our congregation, and we have a meeting of such for a lot of the area. We have a lot of congregations in Birmingham, and so we get together. But that's one of the things that we try to emphasize to the teens, is that the Bible teaches us how to suffer. I mean, when you look from Adam and Eve, and when you look to all the major stories, Noah suffered, right? Abraham suffered, Jacob suffered, Isaac. I mean, all the way through, David suffered, and it culminates with Jesus suffering. All his disciples suffering, and the deaths that they died. And, the one strand that runs through all of it is hope. That it is hope that is the one constant in every one of those stories, that there is hope for that. And I think that, we we don't emphasize that enough. 1 Corinthians 13, when we say, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love, that's really, I think, the only time, if I might be wrong in this, but I think that's the only time they're in that order. That usually it's faith, love, and hope, with the emphasis being on hope, because that's what we have while we're here. The love is the greatest because that's what we'll see when we'll experience that when we get there. But until then, it's hope that gets us there. And I think that's an absolutely true statement. The Bible teaches us to suffer correctly. I guess I should qualify that.
And not a hope that things are going to change, not a hope that things are going to get better, because that's the hope that our neighbors in the world have.
Right.
And that's the way they see our hope. How many times have we been ridiculed for praying and praying and praying and nothing changed? Well, fat lot of good your praying did. Well, and maybe we don't pray like we ought to sometimes. Maybe there's some legitimate failing there, and maybe some people's faith is going to be shaken because they didn't get what they were praying for. But what we should be doing when we're praying in hope is praying that God works something in us, that some good can be accomplished, that I can be drawing closer to God through all of this. And ultimately, of course, the one hope of Ephesians chapter 4, our hope of heaven, that we will endure through this life and find our way home. It's so easy to get caught up in, if I can just make it one more day, maybe tomorrow will be better. And maybe it will. And if it is, then thank God that it got better. And if it's not, God let me down again. Okay, maybe tomorrow. That's not the kind of hope that he holds out for us here. There are plenty of examples in the text. Abraham may be the most obvious example, someone whose hope was never going to be realized. And he knew that, in the fullest sense at least. He was never going to get what he was promised. And he knew that, and he lived his life anyway. When our hope is beyond the Jordan, when our hope is beyond this life, that should empower us to separate our attitude from our circumstances. That should empower us to not live for a better day here, but for a better day there.
Yeah.
And for more purpose here, for more opportunity here, for more faith here, and building up that connection to God that this life is supposed to be all about.
Agreed. I think about the heroes of faith from Hebrews 11. We champion that passage, and we talk about the faith of Abraham, the faith of Noah. None of those men saw the promises fulfilled, right? All of our heroes of faith in the Hall of Faith never saw the promises fulfilled. That Jesus was not only the fulfillment, but the fulfiller of those promises, that it all culminated with him. So they never got to see that. And yet we look at them as great men of faith because they believed in spite of it. They believed, maybe not in spite of it, maybe that's the wrong terminology, but they believed, they believed anyway. Not seeing those promises fulfilled, but believing that they would be. So I think that's a great thing to point out.
Yeah, and my experience there, how tracks with what you're saying, because there are all kinds of people praying for my healing, and I deeply appreciate that. And at the least, I would like to stay here long enough to finish raising my kids. But I find that what I am most concerned about is that throughout this, that I will continue to live courageously, and that I will be able to accomplish the things that God wants me to do. And I don't know what that is, but I'm trying to find it. And it reminds me of the way that the apostles dealt with it when the first time they appeared before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin the Sanhedrin told them to go and don't talk about Jesus anymore. And they come back and they turn to Psalm 2, and they pray to God involving Psalm 2, and they ask for boldness. And that may be the most biblical response to boldness, is not asking for the suffering to be taken away, but asking for boldness to continue to serve God through it. Because, I believe that God can cure my ALS right now if he so chose. And, that there are a handful of people who have had ALS just spontaneously go away. But I don't know that that's what God will do. And I don't feel like that's where I should be putting my hope, because God hasn't promised me that he should, that's nothing more than my desire.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I started including in my prayers a couple of years, I'd say probably, about 5 years ago. And it was a minor situation that I was dealing with, but it was still something that I started adding into my prayers that yes, God, if you could change the situation, change it. But if not, change me. Change how I look at it. Change where my trust is. Change where my faith is. Help me. That if I can't change the world, change mine. That principle. And I think that's an excellent perspective that you just mentioned, Matt.
Yeah, and I really like your expression of that idea too. That's very elegant.
Well,
I've been
circling back to the original,
I've been called a lot of things, but elegant's never one of them.
Well, congratulations.
Your haircut is
All right,
elegant,
I made it.
surely. Well, circling back to the original question, the idea of preparing for hardship without giving into fear. What I keep hearing from everybody involved here is that preparing for suffering is more or less preparing for life. Just giving yourself to God, putting yourself in his hands, and preparing yourself to deal with whatever circumstances may come. I'm not sure how fundamentally different it is from preparing for adulthood or preparing for children or preparing for retirement or preparing for baptism or any other thing that looms in the future at some indefinite place. When we're putting ourselves in God's hands and we know that bad times are out there, the solution is not necessarily to have a particular set of armor, to have a particular set of friends, or any such thing as that. It's to have faith and to be in the habit of turning things over to God, to build up that base reserve of strength, of knowledge, of wisdom, be prepared to act like a Christian, first of all, and then you're prepared to act like a Christian in adverse circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's
have a better
right.
chance at it.
Although something that is also very valuable is doing your best to encourage deep relationships in your life with brethren and to seek those things, because those are the people who will help sustain you when things get rough. And they've been powerfully helpful in all of the times in my life when I've encountered suffering.
Amen. I think about the principle associated with counting the cost. That when we with evangelism and we're teaching someone, we're asking them to count the cost of being a Christian. I think that principle extends well into the other regions of life as well. That with our kids, the way we train our kids to be adults is that we give them little doses, right? We give them little doses to get them used to the idea that that life is going to get harder, right? That as you grow, a lot of, the perspective is always skewed a little where kids look at adults and they go, man, you guys can do whatever you want to, and blah, blah, blah. And that's just not true. But that's the perspective, right? And so we give them little doses of what being an adult is going to be like, to help prepare them. This is probably a bad illustration, but my dad was the kind of guy that would let us hurt ourselves. That if I'm trying to climb up something that's absolutely going to fall on me. I remember in the garage, we had a shelf that had a bunch of paint and stuff on it, and I'm trying to climb up that thing. And, my neighbor's like, you just going to let him do that? My dad's like, yep. Because he won't do it again, but the idea was that to let me hurt myself enough. I mean, not too terribly bad, but enough to get me ready for life, to not make decisions like that associated with that. And so I think there's an idea in counting the cost as Christians where, we recognize that the Christian life is not a pain-free life, that when I give my life to Christ and my sins are forgiven, that burden's taken away, but there might still be consequences I have to deal with. And as a Christian, sometimes my faith will require things of me that are going to hurt me, or they're going to hurt me, maybe not physically, but they might hurt me financially. I might have to quit a job because the company wants me to do something unethical, or I might have to lose a group of friends because they're no longer, I can no longer influence them and they're influencing me, or whatever. There's so many other aspects in which this idea creeps in that we have to, that we have to prepare for. And I think that the Bible gives us all we need in that the scriptures, especially looking at Jeremiah's life and looking at Lamentations, we see a lot of that. Just things that we can take from those stories and in real life say, yes, I'm not the first one to deal with this, and I definitely won't be the last.
Yeah, I think especially for preachers, Jeremiah is useful because, all of us get discouraged with how our work is going, and the country just looks like it's going to go into hell by the quickest road and all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
And well, maybe my work is difficult. My work is not so difficult as Jeremiah's work. And if he could prosper and find success in that, and he can glorify God in that, then I can surely glorify God where I am.
Sure.
In the parenting episode that I did with Ricky Jenkins and Phil Robertson, we talked about suffering some and the attitude that some parents have that their job is to eliminate, or as close as you can to eliminate, the suffering in their children's lives. And I think that is a profound mistake. I think that has disaster written all over it. I don't want my child to suffer any more than anybody else does, but it's not my job to give them a pain-free life. It's my job to turn them into a functional adult, and especially my job in Jesus, to turn them into a functional Christian. And me lying to them and saying you can have a pain-free existence in the world, let alone a pain-free existence in Christ, is nonsense. It's just not. It's not going to help anybody.
Yes.
It's not my job to protect them from suffering. I would like to mitigate their suffering somewhat. I would like to set them up for success as much as I possibly can. But, and I wouldn't follow along with Keith's example of the paint cans because I'm the one cleaning up the mess. I wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
That's painful for me. If they hurt, my daughter breaks her arm doing that, that's her problem. But, cleaning up the mess, I don't want to get involved in that. I don't want the trip to the emergency room and the expense and all that kind of thing. But there is a way that we can teach children about suffering at a very early age. I was teaching my kids about life's not fair in first grade. They find out soon enough. And us pretending like, no, it's not fair yet, but tomorrow it will be. Mom, Dad are going to take care of that. That's not reasonable. That's not possible. As far as that goes, they need to learn about suffering early on and learn that it's not about finding a pain-free life. It's about finding a life in the Lord. It's about finding a functional, purposeful life.
Yes.
And it's going to hurt. Life is painful ever since the fall. That's the way it is. We don't rejoice in that necessarily, but we turn it for good. We turn it for God's purposes, for my family's purposes. As much as I possibly can.
And to some extent, as a parent, I think it's fair to say that I intentionally inflict suffering on my children. It is...
Well, God does it to us, right?
Yeah, well, and, that neither one of them enjoys weeding the front flower bed. I could do it much more quickly than they can do it. It would be much less painful for me if I did it myself instead of making them do it. And yet, every 2 weeks or so, out to the front flower bed they go. And for the next hour, I deal with a continual stream of complaints.
Mm.
But
That's your suffering.
yes. But I think that is teaching them valuable lessons about what life is like, because sometimes you're going to have to go through stuff that you don't want to go through. And this is you learning how to deal with it.
That's right.
You have been listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Thank you for your support. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe through your favorite podcast platform and or on YouTube. Comments, corrections, and suggestions are always welcome. Please feel free to follow me through Facebook, MeWe, Parler, or Instagram, or check out my webpage, www.halhammonds.com. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.